All right. It's 9:30.
Yeah, it's 30 past the hour by my clock, so I think it's time to formally start this. Okay, welcome everybody to the inaugural session, working group session for more instant messaging interoperability. First off, I've been asked to point out that the background image on this title slide was generated using Stable Diffusion, so that's an interesting bit of trivia. Also, we know the date is wrong on the slide. It is in fact March 30th if you're in Japan. Okay. Moving on. So we'd ask you to take a moment to make a note of the IETF policies for how these meetings are run, both in terms of the code of conduct, intellectual property, and of course the mask policy. I think the salient points are that you must wear a mask at all times unless you are actively eating or drinking or at the microphone speaking. Okay. Right, and before I move on, I should ask for a note taker. Do we have any volunteers to take notes for this session, please?
Pete Resnick is taking notes. And
all right, thank you very much,
Campbell.
Pete. Much appreciated. Okay. Next, so the agenda for today, we're going to have a bunch of talks covering a number of drafts that have been submitted already. So first off, Administrivia, which we're doing right now. Next, Rowan is going to talk to us about the content format draft. Then we have a handful of presentations, a number of presentations rather, pertaining to message transport or message transfer or message delivery protocols. Up to you which noun you prefer. First, Travis and Matthew are going to be looking at Matrix as a transport. Then Jonathan Rosenberg on the MIMI transport protocol. Raphael Robert on the MIMI delivery service. And finally, Ecker is going to wrap up this section by discussing all the different requirements, the requirements for these transport or transfer protocols. Then finally, we'll discuss the process for this working group going forward. All right, so any comments, objections to the agenda? All right. Alyssa, over to you.
Thanks. So just to kind of motivate the ordering of items on the agenda and try to get a little bit of a level set on what we as the chairs think is a reasonable prioritization of the work items in this group, since it's the first time it's meeting. We wanted to sort of tick through the main lines of effort and try to give people a clear picture of what we're seeing emerge as the drafts have been rolling in. So there's really kind of 5 lines of effort as articulated in the charter and based on the work that's been done thus far. The first 3 are here on this slide. So there's the content format. This is, how do we express messages going back and forth, and the features that they support. Also includes extensibility to build beyond whatever we standardize. There's a requirements draft that's been submitted in that space, and also a couple of different alternatives for specifications. And of course, there's existing building blocks like MIME and URIs that are being reused in some of those drafts. Then we get to, as Tim said, what is alternatively called sometimes message transfer, message delivery, sometimes called transport. These are all vaguely the same thing. I'm sure we'll settle on a favorite term soon enough. But this is like the protocol mechanics for how providers of messaging services exchange messages, how users on different services initiate contact with each other, and may include some components of implementing how the MLS delivery service functions are performed. So again, here, there's a requirements draft. There's a number of different specifications, and we'll hear from several of those authors today and spend a good chunk of our time today on kind of motivating the requirements for that bit. Then there's what some people have been calling the MLS profile, which is a kind of an explanation of the details of how you operationalize MLS to be able to build a sort of full-featured messaging application. And there's bits of that in Raphael's draft, I think, but hopefully we'll get a little bit more clarity on that as a distinct work item as we go through. Next. And then the last two, identifier naming conventions. So, we need to agree some way of how do we identify all the entities in these systems. There's a couple of drafts there. And then finally, end-to-end identity. So, how do we actually link the cryptographic representation of a user or a client to a non-cryptographic identity in the real world? And this could include some of the MLS authentication service bits as well. And there's a couple of drafts in that space and some existing prior work that could be reused. So if you go to the next slide, the way that we see a logical prioritization of this work is here on this slide. So if we think about this as like, a set of building blocks that over time could be composed to create interoperable messaging services, you obviously absolutely need the content format, and it just kind of seems like the lowest hanging fruit, something that we could come to agreement on potentially more quickly than some of the others. So we think prioritizing that, trying to make progress on that might be a little bit simpler, and we have to do it for everything else anyway, so we might as well do it first. Then the message transfer protocol, and really that's like tied in with the identifier naming conventions. You sort of need both of them to go together. So we think that's the next highest priority. The MLS profile, which hopefully would fall out of that once the transfer protocol is a little bit more mature. And then finally the identity piece, which is quite a bit thornier and we think will take more time. So this is kind of what we're proposing as far as, not strict ordering. It's not like we're not going to work on something later until, the earlier items are absolutely complete. But in terms of how we allocate time for discussion in the working group and how we try to demonstrate progress, this is the chair's proposal for how we prioritize. So any comments or questions on that? Okay, then I think we can kick it off with Rowan, who's going to talk about the content format.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. All right. I'm Rowan May. This is the now basically year-old content format document. Next slide, please. Okay. The goal here is that if we are going to be end-to-end encrypting in a federated or interoperable environment, the thing that is inside of the end-to-end encryption needs to be something that all of the recipients understand. So having a standard format for common instant messaging features would be really useful. So I just did a very informal survey of lots of different consumer and enterprise messaging platforms, and I came up with a list of features and did not get a lot of got some nods and not a lot of people saying, hey, you forgot something, or that's not common. And the list is there: plain enriched text messaging, mentions, replies, reactions, edits and deletes of previously sent messages, expiring messages, delivery notifications and read receipts, message threading, and then sharing files and calling and conferencing. So the sharing files and calling and conferencing, those are not completely in scope, but the others are definitely considered core sort of messages that are sent by lots and lots of different instant messengers. Not coincidentally, this happens to address a MIMI charter item because I was one of the people who was promoting MIMI. This, while its focus is to be like a very kind of small, narrow set of stuff, that we should be able to extend this format and also have the option in some cases of sending proprietary formats alongside of or instead of a standard format. Next slide, please. Okay, so the approach that I took in this version of the draft. So first of all, this version now has an abstract syntax to focus more firmly on the semantics. So when I originally wrote this over a year ago, I wanted to answer the objection of like not inventing a bunch of new stuff. So I used the thing that we did a long time ago in the Instant Messaging and Presence Protocol Working Group called CPIM, which nobody particularly liked at the time, and I still, also thought was ugly. But that was the sole comment that I received on this draft over the last year. So this now has no CPIM at all. But in order to avoid us getting into syntax wars, the semantics are expressed using basically, like a C-struct style definition. But the semantics have remained largely unchanged for this whole year. So what's in there? So each of these, so there is a sort of a thing that I call a message container type, and there is a message report type. A message report just gives the status of a list of messages and what those statuses are. The message container type has a mandatory part, which is a timestamp and a unique message ID. And then it has other optional fields that can be used to give additional information. So we can refer to other messages to indicate a reply or a reaction. We can edit or delete a previously sent message. We can express that there is a fixed expiration time. And we can express the messages as part of a thread. And finally, with the exception of deletions, basically all messages have a body of some kind, because the whole purpose of sending instant messages or reactions or editing a message is to send some actual content. And I will note that there is no sort of equivalent of a to or a from field. And that is because in MIMI, we are assuming that we're going to be using MLS for end-to-end encryption. And I did not want the message container to duplicate information that's already integrity protected by the protocol that's carrying it. So, if we wanted to use this format in another protocol, and we could come up with new corresponding fields, I have no objection to that. But for the sake of clarity and for highlighting this point, I did not include fields that would have been duplicate information of something in the enclosing protocol. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally we had some non-trivial list discussion and comments from mainly from Jonathan and Eric Rescorla. And so I'm going to go through what I think are the most relevant of those. Next slide, please. So regarding this issue, I already touched on for values that are already in MLS. So the to address would be corresponding to the MLS group ID in MLS. It's already integrity protected. And likewise, the sender, the client identity is included in MLS. We can derive this from MLS. The exact details of the formats of those, identifiers, that is still TBD here in MIMI. But the question remains, should we send fields with these semantics in the message container anyway, or should we leave them out because they're already somewhere else in a message in an integrity protected way? So my proposal is that we leave them out when they're already protected in the enclosing protocol, and that if we want to create relevant fields, if we are not using MLS, we are free to do that or create an extension to do that. Does anyone object to this way? Does anyone have a strong objection to this or like to make a comment? Or, if we want, we can defer these until later.
Yeah, let's just do them one by one. So please join the queue in the tool if you want to come up. Okay.
Jonathan.
Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". So I do prefer to have them there all the time. And the main reason is I anticipate this content gets moved around, not just to move through MLS to the client, but like, oh, there'll be a log somewhere on my client, or, oh, I want to report this message was from a malicious person, send me the thing they sent you, right? That there's going to be places this goes, and I sort of like the idea that this is self-contained, fully defining the context by which you can interpret what this is. And without the to and the from, it's like missing the two most important things to be used in any form context, outside of MLS. And so I don't see the harm in having it always there. And just as a design construct, I like the idea of the message being self-contained and not dependent on the MLS layer for fully defining its semantics. And you would be depending on the MLS layer for that information. Thank you.
Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, ACLU. I'm really nervous about trying to include this. So I think I'm on the opposite side from you, Jonathan, here on this discussion. However, if we are saying that these fields might be optionally present, then we still have the same problem. The problem I'm concerned about is when they disagree with what's on the outside. And if we say, well, somebody else could define them optionally later, then they could show up optionally later. And the critical thing is that when you receive a message, you don't get confused between what's on the outside and what's on the inside. So, I would love it if we could say you must not ever define anything that matches these semantics, but I don't know that we can get away with that if this is going to be extensible. And so maybe it is a better idea to say, here's how you could specify it. And here is very strict guidance on what to do when receiving the thing, so that you don't have the classic confusion where the message on the outside said it was from and to blah, blah, blah. And on the inside, it says it was from and to somebody else.
Yeah, I'm Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, ACLU, which is the point DKG was just making. It is a bad idea to have these fields exist for exactly the reason he's indicating, because there's an opportunity to have them be incorrect. I think my rank ordering is roughly the same as DKG's. I wish we could make it impossible, but if we can't make it impossible, we should make it very, very clear that there's really just no use for them. Like, there's just no valid use for them. And the two is actually the two is actually in some sense even worse, right? Because the two doesn't. The from at least reflects some MLS state. The two is just a bare assertion with no that doesn't even really reflect that. Only partially reflects MLS state. So I think these are bad news.
Yeah, and I want to point out one other thing, which is that the group ID is the thing that is integrity protected. But in terms of what you might actually store on a client in a encrypted at rest database is could be like a mapping from that to something else. It's quite likely that it may have a friendlier name or a more localized way of recording that information. And likewise, the sender is the client's identifier, which is probably not exactly the user identifier that a user would want to see when going through a list of messages. Raphael.
Yeah, I fully agree with DKG1 and DKG2. I also wanted to add that what users get to see in the end, in terms of who the sender is, that authentication has to come from the MLS layer anyway, because otherwise there's a huge risk you display something that's a mismatch. And then the question is, why do you need to repeat it, and what do you do with it in practical terms if what you display anyway comes from the MLS layer? It's a security property here.
Yep. Finally, Raphael, if you could stay at the microphone for a second. I wanted to point out that the sender might be a pseudonymous address, which is used for privacy, Jonathan. The sender might be pseudonymous. It might be a pseudonym for privacy purposes. And so it's unclear if that's really what you want to store in your database or whether you want to actually de-pseudonymize, come up with the actual user's identity. Okay.
Harold?
Two questions because one because I don't understand everything. The MLS values, are they known to the sender before he starts composing the message?
Yes.
Good. So it's possible to store them. The other thing is a comment more or less to Jonathan. A log entry saying message from and to is an assertion of the message having been sent. It's not the message. I think we should keep these as two distinct entities. We might want to define both.
Suhas?
Hi, Suhas Cisco. I get the security point of having the MLS be the source of truth for this information, but there are many middle boxes, or some of the proposals that we have is that, talking to the providers, between the providers, they might not have an access to the MLS context, and they have to make some decisions based on that. They need to have information. We need to agree with DKG saying that we need to provide that information taken from the MLS and put it in the outer envelope, but that should be.
How would they read that information inside the content format, which is end-to-end encrypted, specifically so the provider cannot read it?
Are we making that requirement?
That is currently a requirement the way the charter is written.
Okay.
So there's no way that the middle boxes that the providers could inspect this if it did exist.
Okay, thanks.
So we're going to close the queue on this in a minute. If you want to get in the queue, please get in there now. Go ahead, Martin.
Okay, Martin Durst, Yamaguchi University. One thing that we also should think about is that things like forward or retweet or so, where you have a message or maybe part of a message that was transferred, then included in another one, and there you might want some information on who sent it to whom, and the question then is also how to do that.
So I guess that my first question is, are you including it by value or are you including it by reference?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because if you're including it by value, then the sender can lie and put whatever they want.
Yes.
If you're including it by reference, then you simply would use a message ID of a message that the sender had previously received.
All kinds of possibilities that's there, from just putting some general information, this was John Smith who sent it, to having some encryption, signing stuff to make sure it's really the one that happened, whatever. But it's something we should also think about.
Okay.
So I guess it's my turn. Thanks. I was just gonna kind of chime in on this in favor of expressing this information inside the message. On the basis of the analogy as I put in the chat between the HTTP host header and SNI, there's kind of an okay mapping between TLS and MLS here, in that the credentials that are carried in either of those cases can authenticate multiple identifiers. And a given message will want to be from one of those identifiers. And so I think it's plausible that we would express, you're gonna have to do the mapping, you're gonna have to verify that the claimed identifier is one of the ones that's authenticated. But I think it's plausible that you might choose one among the set.
Colin?
Colin Jennings. I was really getting at my major point is I think this is too low level of detail for us to worry about right now. I think we should get into this much later in the working group as we get closer to the end, and I get the arguments both ways. I think there'll be, people need to keep in mind MLS requires you to delete your keys pretty frequently, and most of the clients I'm familiar with display history going much farther back than that. So there will be at least some parts of it where, and Rowan, you were touching on that, of this data will promptly be copied from wherever it was on the wire to somewhere else in a different way. And I just think this is an irrelevant detail at this stage of where we are in the working group, and we need to get the big picture right. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right.
I think that's a lovely time for us to go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay. So this is not so much a question as just a restatement of something that is not obvious, because the detail of this is not in this working group. So how does a client know what formats are okay to use? So there is the content advertisement extension, which is part of draft IETF MLS extensions, section 2.3. And then there is that uses mechanism in the leaf node and key packages sections of the MLS core protocol and the required capabilities extension of the MLS protocol. But basically, you can always tell what the supported media types are for any member of a group that you're in, because those are in the leaf nodes for that, for each of those users. You can tell when you go fetch a key package, because you want to try to add someone to a group, what they support. You can tell what the required media types are, if any, for a group. And there's MLS enforces that all clients need to support all of the mandatory required capabilities. And then you can update that if the resulting group is still consistent. You can update that with a group context extensions proposal. So that's how it works. If you go and read these sections and still don't think it works, or you see a problem, please come to me or send a message on the mailing list and we'll figure it out. Next slide, please. Okay, we had a long discussion about the difference between threads and replies. So the intention of in reply to is that a single message that you are about to send is in reply to a single previous message, specific previous message. And that the intention was that this is not to be used for selecting the order of messages or to be used for threading or anything of that nature. And I have here the example of the user interface of two different messengers. One which is vaguely hybrid consumer enterprise, and the other which is consumer, using this feature. So we also in this draft use in reply to for reactions. So if you want to like a message or unlike a message, because a reaction is always directly in response to a single previous message. You're liking that message. And in most of the systems that implement this, you can reply to a reply, you can reply to a reply to a reply, you can like a reply, you can unlike a reply. So, but importantly, this is a reference to the previous message. So the sender, the composer of the reply isn't editing the replied message like you do in email, replies in line. Most messaging systems just quote the most recent message in the reply, but you could presumably have show some tree of, or show some hierarchy of replies to replies to replies. Most importantly, this doesn't affect the rendering order in any of these systems. So I, can reply to a message that was a month old. And indeed, often this is, somebody says, what's the, how do I find this thing? And I go and I, reply to basically bump a conversation back to something that happened 3 weeks ago. That's all kind of normal behavior of the way that replies are used today. So the way that the draft is written in reply to is completely consistent with this existing behavior. Any clarifying questions on this? Okay, next slide, please. All right, there are also messaging systems that have threading. So this is particularly useful in enterprise IM systems. Slack does an excellent job of the user interface for this. Basically, all the messages in a thread are rendered linearly. There is no indentation. There's no, you don't specifically reply to a specific message in a thread. You just send a message in the thread, and if you didn't mean to send a message about that topic, you should have created another thread or replied in the main group or channel. So consistent with that usage, a thread ID in this document identifies a single ancestor message ID. All messages that have the same ancestor message ID would be rendered in a single list of messages. And there is no attempt to define what the rendering order is according to any other field. The only time that in reply to seems that it is appropriate in threads is when you are liking or unliking a message that is in the thread. So I assumed that we don't need to use any specific new header for specific rendering order, and that you can just use the timestamp. Eric.
Yeah, so you and I discussed this in the list. I think this is a bad idea for several reasons. First of all, client clocks are not actually very good. We see that very often. Second, it's it's really quite common. So it's quite common for clocks to be actually quite wrong. And within a thread, 30 seconds is actually quite enough to change the ordering. Second, there's an obvious attack here, which is I set my clock even modestly far in the future, and now I'm by the bottom of the thread, and I just stay at the bottom of the thread. So as I said in the message, I think it made much more sense to actually specify the parent message. And I think even more generally, I think that this is sort of like projecting too much of the user interface of the system into the protocol, which is I would only do in reply to, and that creates a DAG, and then I would allow the system to decide how to display that, whether it's threads or replies.
Sorry, could you say that last part a little more slowly and clearly? Because even I didn't understand what you said.
I would only do in reply to, and I would not do threads, and I would allow the receiving system to decide how this was displayed.
Okay. So I really don't like using in reply to for threading at all, because the semantics of in reply to in my opinion, are very clear and do something very useful, which is totally different than what you're proposing for threading. But I don't have any objection to having something separate about the parent, parent and thread, or something different, which does what you described.
Well, as I said, I think that's an issue for the client to decide how to render the information. I'm not persuaded their semantics are in fact as different as you think they are.
Okay.
Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. I'm sorry that I'm not following this as closely as I would like to, but I don't actually understand how this threading mechanism works. So my understanding is that every message that has a single ancestor message thread ID, ancestor message ID marked as a thread, as the thread ID, is in the same thread, right? But those messages themselves have message IDs.
Yes.
And I can then make a new message that has one of those messages as an ancestor.
No, you can't have an answer. Yes. Yes. Please go ahead. Yes.
So is the ancestor message in the thread or not?
The ancestor message had a thread ID that was with a bunch of other messages. All those messages are in a thread.
Okay. And so now if I make a new message and it chooses its ancestor thread ID to be one of the messages that's not the ancestor, is it in the thread? Is it in the same thread, or is it a separate?
It is in its own. It's in its own thread that it has.
And its ancestor is not in its own thread.
Correct.
So some ancestors are joined to the thread and other ancestors are not.
Correct.
I find this very confusing as a concept, and I don't know how I would represent that to the user in any way that they would understand what the hell is going on.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We're going to close the queue in a minute, so if you want to be in the queue for this, please get in. Travis.
metrics.org. I do agree that threads and replies are different, and they have different semantics, though it is quite, I guess, important, I think, for replies in threads to be possible, particularly just for larger conversations.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Jonathan Rosenberg. Yeah, I also agree that threads and replies are different. And I think they run the risk of leading to a different form of interoperability, which is defying user expectations. That I sent something on one system that to me was starting a thread, and to the other person it looks like a reply, or vice versa. These are the kind of like confusion and interoperability challenges that have plagued systems. So I think being more rigorous with making sure that the experience that the two users get in the system is consistent, independent of who their providers are, I think is an important property. So I'm strongly in favor of having two separate concepts here.
Brian Gondwana, most of what I want to say has already been said. I just want to say in reply to from email is not the same as this. And I think a lot of people have a mental model from email. This is not that. So it's specifically saying this needs to be linked back to that message, maybe just flow a quote from it, something like that is the kind of in reply to you often see in instant messaging, not the threading model that I happen to build on in reply to from email.
Colin Jennings, I want to up-level this one thing of we're getting into this thing of, are we trying to define such that two different users on different clients are going to have the same sort of visual representation and experience of this? And I think that we're going to have to come down on all of these types of things of whether we're trying to define this well enough that you have that, or define it well enough like, we got some bits, your general direction, and like you may or may not put them in a confusing way on your screen in your system, how you lay it out, which I suspect is a more realistic target for us at this point in time. And I think that we should just try and have enough semantics here that when we look at all the different systems we have to map to with this and similar problems are going to come up to it, that we don't result in something where the way we map the semantics into, or the message bits into the given clients with different UIs, that we resulted in behavior where the end user gets the wrong message. Like, you know, somebody just sends a no in reply to something, and two different clients appear to make that no coupled with totally different messages. And so we have to have enough semantic information, and that should be our bar. It's just enough to get that level and no higher than that. Like I'm shooting for the minimal bar here. So that's my view of the minimal viable product.
Okay, I like that bar. Are folks generally happy with that bar? Yeah, Pete.
Pete, you're in the queue. You're done?
Okay.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask one sort of question now. So
Okay.
I'm going to try to re-summarize what I think I heard from everybody at the microphone. So I think that there were a number of people who agreed with me that in reply to in this context has a different semantic than things that you do in email and things that you might do in threading. But that threading is, as specified here, is underspecified and needs more work. Does that seem like a generally reasonable summary of the state of this? Ecker?
I'm not sure.
Okay, maybe.
Yeah, I think either way.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like this needs a deeper dive, but overall people are interested in some protocol support for both of these independent concepts, not solving the entire UI problem.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you to jump to the end because we're close to the end of your time slot, and
okay,
we want to talk about the.
Can we just skim through so I can see the?
Yeah, just you can sort of say this is what
Okay,
that would have been, but we're not going to talk about it.
Yeah. Okay. This one I kind of wanted to get the apps area folks input, but let's go to the
We'll
next
have
one.
to do it on the list. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we can do it separately. Next. Okay, that is basically there are some things where, like, you know, particularly some of the comments that Ecker made and a couple of comments about like message immutability that Jonathan made. It's like, yes, you're right. There should be some language in there. I'm going to include that in the next version of the draft. Those things were non-controversial, so I didn't do slides on them. Next. Next slide. Okay, so this is the big question. Do we think that that this is a reasonable starting point? The semantics here for a working group document.
So if anybody has comments other than yes or no, please put yourself in the queue. Okay, Vittorio.
Hi, Vittorio Bertola. I had a comment on slide 4, which was before when the queue was open. But very quickly, it was about message editing and deletion. This is a policy mess because there are cases in which you really want the recipient not to obey a request to edit or delete the message, because that may be, for example, a threatening message that they want to report to police or law enforcement, and they need to have it as evidence. There are cases in which you really want the recipient to obey the request, because, for example, it's the sender who's asking a GDPR removal of personal information or whatever. So we will have time to discuss this. I'm just wondering whether there should be a way to convey within the message a reason for this, which will still be the sender's declaration, so not on their word, but at least say, I'm asking because of this. I mean, codified or not, we can decide.
Let's take this to the list, but I'm just going to point out that the messages are always there. The messages are immutable, so the old message is still there. It's just you have the old message and the new message, and then it's a case of how you get that information.
I mean, most of these will be the recipient client deciding what to do, if to allow the recipient to retrieve the older version of the message or not, but still needs to be worked out.
Okay, so back to this question.
DKG.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to observe to the previous question that there's no authorization markings in here at all for things like deletion or editing, right? You get a message ID, there's no from or to in the message. Anybody could supply something with the same message ID that could potentially modify the message. You may have messages in different MLS contexts where somebody specifies the same message ID and it pops up in an entirely different thread. So the user agent is going to need to decide how to authorize something like a deletion or an edit anyway. Like, this is entirely agnostic on that. I think that's fine, but we shouldn't pretend that we're going to bake the authorization in here right now.
That's a good point. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to open a poll on the question of working group adoption.
I'm going to raise my hand too.
You're going to, okay, yeah, I think it's
Just be fair. Raise hand for adopting.
raise hand for adopting, and do not raise hand if you oppose the adoption in the tool, Suhas. Thank you. You could do it in the room too if you want. But you can like put your hand on the floor. You can frown under your mask so that we can't see it. All right, it looks like trickling
One
in.
objection.
We have one objection, so I think. Would
Got it.
you, here, so if I end this, then we can still see the results?
Yep.
or- Yeah,
Yep.
okay. Okay. So it seems like we have strong support for adoption, but if anybody who does object would like to come and talk about why, please do so now if you want to. You don't have to.
All right.
Okay, well, we'll confirm on the list, but I think for now we have a good indication of support for this document, so
Do you want to
thank
go to the
you.
next, or can I get 1 minute on 2 previous slides? You can say no.
I think we should probably move on, yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
But Harold is coming up for one last comment here, so. Why don't you
Just
stay?
a quick
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
What's the preferred method of nitpicking the draft to death? GitHub or mail?
If you have nits or proposed text that you don't think changes the semantics, please just send me feel free to send either. Like PR is totally, I'm happy to take. If you're discussing like a substantive change, please send an email, and feel free to contact me on any of the, any reasonable electronic mechanism or in person.
Thank you. I think also you'll respin it as the working group document, and then once that happens, we'll put it in the working group repo.
Yeah.
And use that as the place for PRs and issues. So
thanks.
Thank you. Okay. So moving on to who is first? Matthew? Is Matthew first? I think, yeah.
There we go. Would you like me to drive your slides for you?
Yes, that would be amazing. Thank you.
No problem.
A new deck is being shared. If I start coughing everywhere, please be aware I'm not ill. It's just a long-term cough that I've developed, so don't be scared. So I wanted to talk about Matrix for Mimi, particularly in the context of delivery and transport. To do that justice, I need to explain what Matrix is quickly for people who might not be familiar with it. So please indulge me for a few slides whilst we do that. Next slide, please. So Matrix is an existing open protocol, which is used in an open network for secure, decentralized real-time communication. We began it back in 2014. It is openly specified with an open governance model by the Matrix.org Software Foundation, which is a non-profit entity that goes and basically publishes a bunch of specs, which are characterized by a lot of Markdown and a lot of open API to actually define both client-server and server-server APIs and various other types of APIs for sending messages around the place, which look very, very similar to the content format that we were just discussing. You can use it for chat interoperability. You could also use it for VoIP signaling, providing SIP-like semantics. You can use it for any real-time structured data, such as VR, AR, or IoT. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do is basically provide a real-time communication layer for the open web. Next, please. So wanted to discuss two IDs. One is Matrix as an overall framework for applicability for Mimi. Next, please. Which have been mainly written by my colleague Travis Ralston, who's attending remotely. I'm getting to basically steal his slides because I'm here in person. So in terms of what Matrix provides today, already used for interoperable chat, there are about 100 million users on the public network and about 100,000 independent instances out there. And in today's incarnation, rooms get replicated or conversations get replicated, much like Git, across participating servers. Now, really interestingly, you have access controls built into the protocol to define a hierarchy of users within a conversation who get a linear number that says how much power they have. Typically 0 to 100. 100 means admin, 0 means completely unprivileged, and then you put thresholds on those access controls for the operations you can do, such as invite people or ban them or send particular key value data into the room or send messages, etc. These are defined by room versions, and we're currently on version 11 of the protocol under the hood because it basically agilely upgrades itself as we change the semantics. Events express messages. It's extensible so that you can have fallback representations. You have end-to-end encryption, including MLS or decentralized MLS or double ratchet. And out of the box, as a transport, we just use simple HTTP and JSON APIs. Next slide, please. So the current incarnation is quite complicated in that it provides eventual consistency. Any instance participating in a conversation can go offline and then resynchronize later. We copy GET by having a directed acyclic graph that signs these events into effectively a tree. And then if servers come and go, you heal the DAG and resynchronize together. And there is a fun merge resolution algorithm called state resolution that governs how you authorize events, how you merge them back together. And particularly in the context of the Digital Markets Act, this isn't the easiest thing to implement. Next slide, please. So in terms of how this maps to the MIMI concept, on the messaging framework side of things, we have the room versions that express particular versions of the protocol, for instance, how access control works and permissions. Then for messaging format, we already have extensible events, which are basically identical semantically to what we were just talking about, although we do have separate threads and replies, and you can reply within a thread. You then have the transport, which is HTTP and JSON, but again, could be anything. Identity is a mess, let's ignore that. And then for encryption, we use OM and MEGOM, which is double ratchet, but also MLS and DMLS, and it can be completely extensible in terms of, for instance, post-quantum implementations as well. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to talk about specifically today is that we've done the thought experiment of what if Matrix didn't have a DAG? What if it was a much more simple thing to implement? Next slide. And so we've called this imaginatively linearized matrix. Apologies to all the offended mathematicians in the audience, because we are literally taking the directed acyclic graph and we are flattening it to an array. Next slide, please. So this partially centralizes conversations around owner for a given conversation. And the key thing is that it just recycles and reuses the existing access controls that we have in Matrix, things like power level that says, you know, whether a user's got power 100 or 0, and whether they're allowed to invite or ban people, etc. Still uses plain old Matrix events. However, it represents the room as a single list rather than a DAG. Much easier to implement and reason about, and to prove it, Travis, who wrote these slides and has been mainly working on this, has just written a Matrix home server imaginatively called Linearized Matrix, which you can find on github.com/matrix-org/linearized with a Z dash matrix, and was put together in about 24 hours to see that you could have something that implements these semantics in a kind of hub and spoke model rather than the full mesh that you have in today's Matrix. You can put it over whatever transport you like, but for particularly interestingly, it doesn't shut the door on decentralization. You can take the matrix events in these flattened matrix rooms, and you can still go and decentralize them if that's what you're into. Next slide, please. So practically speaking, it looks like this sort of thing. The blue splobs are, I guess, linearized matrix servers. Green things could be talking whatever API into those instances. And a given conversation is literally a hub and spoke where the room owner is on the left-hand side. Next slide, please. So concretely in a DMA world, you could basically end up with, say, and this is obviously hypothetical names, iMessage, Wire, Telegram, and WhatsApp, all going and running linearized matrix or exposing linearized matrix APIs of their existing offerings with existing clients hanging off it. You could also have today's DAG-capable matrix off the right-hand side if you wanted to take those conversations and decentralize them across the wider matrix network. And I'm out of time, but I think that might have been the last slide.
Great.
Thank you very much. Perfect timing.
Yeah, well done. So we're just going to take clarifying questions on these first three presentations. If anybody has a clarifying question, then we'll have a lot of time to talk later about requirements emerging from all three of these. Anybody? Going once? Going twice? No. Okay. Jonathan is next.
Okay, so this is really a straw man protocol, trying to think about what would a solution potentially look like, something to throw rocks at and evolve from here. Next slide. So rather than go into super details, I'm going to call out some of the decisions that or assumptions made in the draft, and I'm going to go into detail on a couple of them. One is sort of similar to the linearized matrix concept we just heard. It makes the assumption that a group chat has like this idea of an owner, and everyone else is sort of hanging off of the owner. That's relevant from a state synchronization perspective. We're trying to synchronize off of the single source of truth, which is the owner, the provider. It focuses on server to server. It doesn't try and define what a client protocol looks like. That's because of the scope here we're trying to solve for is server to server federation. It's based on this idea of doing synchronization by pulling messages from the guest provider. This is partly as an anti-spam measure so that messages can't be delivered to a recipient that doesn't want them on the provider level. You have to ask for them. There's a synchronization process that happens. I'll get into that's on a per group chat basis. It uses long poll. Nobody loves this. This got rewritten 2 times even while writing this draft. We can have a healthy debate about it. I have absolutely no skin in the game, but that's what's in there right now. It introduces this idea that in a room, there's 2 different pieces of state that are relevant. Properties that are where we only care about the current version, the name of the group, the topic. The membership is a form of property too, as opposed to messages for which each of them is a new thing and there's a temporal sequencing and my UI renders the most recent stuff first and I might be able to scroll backwards. Those are different. The protocol treats them differently. And lastly, which I won't talk about, is it proposes a few ideas on out-of-band connection authorization for anti-spam. Next slide, please. 5 minutes. Okay, so I already talked about this, properties versus messages. Yep, next slide. So here's sort of the framework picture for the protocol. You have users, they're attached to providers, and this protocol runs between providers, largely messages initiated by the guest provider to the owning provider, 2 separate pieces, sort of RESTful style operations using REST plus JSON to do things like send a message, retrieve the group membership, retrieve properties like the name of the group, and then a synchronization process by which all changes are delivered. Those changes can be new messages as well as changes in properties. And each of those is represented by an event that has a timestamp and thus allows synchronization. And then there's out-of-band comms, which again I won't talk about. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the sync model, which is, I think, important because it's one of the ways in which this is different from simple, different from classic XMPP, which is it's trying to treat this more like a distributed database, not a distributed database problem, a database problem where we want to reliably replicate data from an owning provider to a guest provider. So through some process, which in this doc is the out-of-band, could be an in-band invitation, a bunch of other things, the guest provider learns that one of its users is now in a group for a particular group chat ID and therefore needs to start synchronization. So there's a requirement that the guest provider basically has a list that it maintains of the group IDs in each owning provider that it needs to synchronize. And that's part of the responsibility of the protocol, is to make sure that information can be learned by the guest provider. But let's start with that. So they know the groups I need to go synchronize. Next slide, please. So what will happen is the guest provider uses first REST APIs to fetch group properties. So it does that to establish its initial view of the state. So you can imagine if the user first joins the group, they're going to tap on the membership list. They want to see all the members right now. That enables them to get that information. Next slide. Then the interesting stuff happens where there's a subscription. So the subscription is implemented as a long poll in this document. And what it does is a subscription is an HTTP request that contains a from and a to. Please, Mr. Owning Provider, give me all the messages starting from this timestamp to this timestamp. And it allows for the to be empty, which means I'm specifying only the start portion, which means keep sending me stuff on an ongoing basis. And that's what establishes the sort of subscription to keep information fresh. Synchronization is achieved by allowing the guest provider to use a timestamp to indicate the last point in time at which has gotten all of the messages. So if there was some gap, and I'll show that in a moment, it can resynchronize by asking for everything since the last timestamp. This provides a burden on the owning provider to persistently store those messages for a decent amount of time. The good news is that's what persistent group chat is. And that's why this sort of works in this model, is you're already having to store this data anyway, therefore allowing the guest provider to synchronize off of it. Next slide. So once the long poll or the subscription is created, a sequence of events shows up. The events, like I said, have a time and a type. The typing is not well specified in the draft. This is an individual 00 after all, but it's meant for a bunch of different things. A new message of the format that Rowan just shared. It could be a change in a property. So for example, a group name has changed. It also talks about things like it would be MLS messages might show up here also as different types of events. Next slide. All right, so one of the things you can do with this is deal with failure. So let's say at some point there's a network partition or the servers or the entire cluster on the guest provider side goes down. The last event it saw had a timestamp of T2. Next slide. What it could do is send a request saying, give me everything since T2. T2 maybe yesterday. And then the owning provider does a, it spurts out everything in the history as well as then anything that continues to come since then, what's called as catch the running train problem in database synchronization. Next slide. So another big idea here is we want to design this for not server to server, but cluster to cluster or service to service, and make sure it works in a modern web practice where if you look at the owning side, there's some HTTP load balancers of a variety of different sorts that are sending these requests to instances, stateless nodes in a cluster, Kubernetes, or whatever your flavor of the year is. And so the protocol is specifically designed to enable that. So the guest server, like I said, there's a list of groups that the guest provider knows it has to synchronize. And this could measure in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands for a large consumer system. So there's an algorithm not specified, of course, by the protocol by which the work of doing the synchronization is spread across servers on the guest side. So you can see here in this particular picture, guest server 1 is doing subscriptions for group 1 and 2, server the next one for 3 and 4, and so on and so forth. Because each message and event has a unique ID, is immutable, it's okay if two servers subscribe to the same information, they can all be deduplicated. And it all gets nicely load balanced on the receiving side. And I'm out of time, but I think that's also pretty much the end. Next slide.
Yeah, that's it.
That was all my slides.
Yeah.
There is no
That
next
is the
slide.
end. All right, outstanding.
DKG?
This seems to think that the servers they know the message ID. This is a different message ID than the message ID that Rohan was talking about?
That is a great question. And indeed, it would either need to be copied or a different number. I don't know is the answer, by the way, but this needs to be visible at the transport protocol layer. So it needs to be outside of the payload that would be end-to-end encrypted with MLS. So in this case, it might make sense to be different.
I think it should be different.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't want to identify that something is an edit.
Yeah. Actually, I take it back. Now that I think about it, it has to be different because these events include things that aren't even MLS messages.
So yeah, please don't use the same words in the two different drafts. I mean, you can figure out how to differentiate it, but
all right, but we're in agreement. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to close the queue. So Suhas, if you want to be in the queue, get in the queue. Go ahead, Ecker.
I like your pessimism that it's only be hundreds of thousands of groups as opposed to tens of millions of groups. I can't imagine how many people are going to have iMessage, WhatsApp crossover if that ever happens.
Yeah.
In the previous slide, you sort of mentioned timestamps as the sort of form of indexing.
Yeah.
And here you're mentioning message IDs.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe that is not a desirable state of affairs. In order to do synchronization effectively, you need a sequential
timestamp.
Timestamp.
Yeah.
Uniqueness, however, is a message ID. There's a straightforward way to provide uniqueness for messages, which is to hash them.
Yep.
And so I think that's of course a very common kind of idiom in these synchronization systems. So I think I would suggest that in fact timestamps are undesirable here, and sequence numbers are what you want because they have to be assigned essentially anyway.
Yep.
Rather than trying to tie them, they can of course be assigned by time, but I would say rather index is what actually.
Yeah. So this is a great comment. So I think you're right. Again, this is the relative immaturity of the draft, but I think it is for purposes of the synchronization. It is in fact a sequential number that doesn't need to be contiguous. In fact, continuousness is incredibly probably not a good idea. It's hard to guarantee.
Yeah.
But the sequential, or sorry, the increasing nature of them can be provided by any number of means, including sampling the timestamp at sufficient granularity. But the property we need is that no two messages have the same value, and that they continue to increase. So you know that if you've received everything less than a certain value, you're synchronized up to that point. That's the property that we need.
Yeah. We should talk about this perhaps in more detailed time, but I'm not sure quite how well. I agree with you. Maintaining no gaps is difficult, but I'm not quite sure exactly how well synchronization with gaps is going to work without some mechanism of being able to know where the gaps are. But
yeah,
we can talk about this.
fair enough.
Hi, Rowan May, and I'm going to try to make this a little bit more of a meta level comment about when you're doing end-to-end encryption, things that are inside the servers can't help you validate,
Right.
or you can't, cooperatively validate, unless you put a copy of them on the outside. Then the providers could theoretically go and do some validation that those things look sane, but then you would also where's DTG? There. You would also need to compare those things with what the client would need to be able to compare the outer thing with the inner thing and make sure that they are consistent.
Yeah.
So thanks.
I think we'd already agreed on this point. And the timestamp mentioned here, is not even relevant for the client at all. This is, again, this protocol is a server-to-server protocol. It's used for the guest provider to figure out whether it's got all the messages from the owning provider.
I'm sorry, Martin, the queue was closed because we have to move on to the next one. So let's take
All
it
right,
to the
thank you.
list. Thank you, Jonathan, and we're ready for Raphael.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I didn't state my name earlier. I'm Raphael Robert. I'm affiliated with Phoenix R&D, and because that might be relevant for the talk,
Can you pull the mic up to your
Sorry, I have
face?
to be really close.
There you go.
So I'm Raphael Robert, affiliated with Phoenix R&D, and because that might be relevant for the talk now, we have been doing a lot of research over the past year and a half around architectural questions around MLS. So the document is a delivery service, and so those of you who have followed MLS might be familiar with the term. If not, next slide, please. So both the MLS protocol document and architecture document explain that there are two components that are necessary if you want to operate MLS. One is the authentication service. We're not going to talk about that today. The other one is the delivery service. So to put it quite bluntly, if you want to operate MLS, you need a delivery service. And so this document and now the talk also is informed by the question, what could be the most generic delivery service? So that is useful for as many operators as possible, and incidentally also that it is easier to get some consensus. Next slide, please. So a delivery service comes in two flavors. One is strongly consistent, the other one is eventually consistent. So I need to explain a little bit what a delivery service does. It does some things that are comparatively trivial in the sense that it makes key packages available, which is essentially public key material for clients. But then it does one thing that is very important. It takes care of ordering messages. So the underlying algorithm of MLS called TreeChem needs message ordering. It's just a requirement of that algorithm. And so there are two ways of doing it. Either you do it in real time, and then you reject messages that are out of order, or you do it eventually after they've been sent. What that means is that you have some forks in the MLS groups, most likely, until the ordering has happened. So these are two very different concepts, and they're not necessarily competing with each other because they address very different architectures and different scenarios. Again, thinking about what's most generic, the strongly consistent one seems to align with a lot of messengers. So this is what we picked for now. Next slide, please. So here's a diagram that's sort of similar to what we just saw from Jonathan's presentation. The logic here is that users are associated with providers. So here we have Alice with A.com and Bob with B.com. And we have an owning delivery service, which is essentially a network component that owns group state and that does message ordering. So this could either be hosted with A.com or B.com. And just to illustrate that it could be both, it appears as a third component here. And then both Alice and Bob need to talk to the delivery service. And this is what this protocol is about. Next slide, please. So I can also go quicker over that one. Again, it is very similar to what's been presented before. So Alice, there's a part A where a user talks directly to the owning DS to send messages or to add people to a group, etc. And then that needs to be fanned out to the other users on other domains. And that is part B of the protocol, which is much less. So the protocol is 80 or 90% about part A. And finally, part C is not needed for interop. That can be completely proprietary. So the idea here is to have a protocol that is completely agnostic of the transport layer underneath. So that could be HTTP, could be XMPP, could be matrix, whatever. For now, the proposal is to use TLS encoding because we've already done that with MLS, and that seems to work pretty well. But of course, that would be up for debate. It could be anything. For part A, it is a requests response, so it could be a RESTful API. Part B is push, pull, or potentially both. Next slide, please. So on a very high level, these, I think, is an exhaustive list of what you can do with MLS. So if you build Messenger on top of MLS, you sort of have to figure out how you can do whatever you want to do based on all of these things. So I'm not going to go through all of them. They're pretty self-explanatory. I just want to note that it supports the 4 ways of joining a group. So MLS have 4 ways of joining a group. So what's less vanilla MLS is that we make a distinction here between one-to-one connection requests and actual groups. And very importantly, it supports resync. So that's important because in reality, bits flip on clients and state gets corrupted. And then you cannot decrypt messages anymore. So with pairized protocols, this is already not great, but with MLS, it's even worse because you get kicked out of a group. So the idea here is that you, with one operation that is completely asynchronous, where you don't rely on any other party, except for the server to be available, you can just reinsert yourself into the group. Next slide, please. And then in terms of capabilities, it supports multi-device support, meaning a user can have several devices. It can enforce ACLs, but it does not specify how that works. It would effectively be compatible with anything else. We standardize around that. The important part here is that this can be enforced on the server side. There are various kinds of rate limiting you can do. That's important for abuse protection, DOS, spam, etc. As I already mentioned, can distinguish between one-to-one connections and groups. And on list recently, we said that that's very important for spam. Because then you have one-to-one connections that are consent-based, and you cannot add people to groups unless you have one of those connections. Next slide, please. So how does it work? This network side component holds some state, which is just derived from MLS, essentially. So again, if you know MLS, this is going to look very familiar. There's a ratchet tree, there's a group info, all of that comes from the MLS protocol. There's a bit more information about per client, per user authentication, and then, of course, key packages. So next slide, please. The final thing is, this is great in enterprise, for enterprise messaging. But this as such does not work at all for consumer messaging, because the status quo is that for the past 10 years, we've had Signal, and Signal has demonstrated that you do not need to keep metadata server-side to successfully operate a messaging service, and we cannot go back to requiring having metadata. So what we've been working on is a variation of that protocol, and I'm sorry I'm going over time of this, to essentially eliminate any sensitive metadata from that. So I'm not going to go into the details, but happy to talk more about it later and to explain. But the idea is that you have all the functionality, including the robustness and the security, while not really having to store sensitive metadata. So yeah, thank you. I'm out of time.
Thanks. Okay, Mallory, and then we're going to move on to the next presenter.
Thanks, Mallory Nodal. So this seems to me that it's not server bridging, but you have an owner of the delivery service, which I think locks users in a way that the protocol design without an owner of the delivery service, or without an assigned one anyway, wouldn't do, and that Alice and Bob could eventually migrate to a different service and still maintain the same chat. But this doesn't seem like that would work there. And so I like, actually, I'm glad you got to the last slide, because I think that where you have enterprise as not a possible flip of services for the users involved in such a sort of complete way, this actually makes sense for that case. But I think for consumer end users, this would probably not work unless you have an immediate idea for that.
Sorry, can you repeat what part would not work for consumers? The fact that you cannot migrate or something else?
Right. So Alice and Bob, if they're using a shared protocol, one of them could, eventually change services. Maybe they migrated to a different service, they could still maintain that chat that they have, even if that user decides to change identity and has a different server. But if they both do it, maybe they're not even using the service that their chat originated on. So your delivery service is still in the middle, even though your two users are no longer using either one of them. So I don't know I don't think that actually would
that's a great question. So
yeah.
I didn't have time to get into that because 7 minutes is just too short. But so the variant of the delivery service that is strongly consistent, meaning the only requirement here is that it has to be able to decide in real time. It does not mean that it cannot move. So we could absolutely migrate from one, what I call an owning delivery service here, to another one, as long as there is agreement. And agreement is one of the things we are very good at doing with MLS. We can have agreement on arbitrary stuff. We have agreement on the membership, but we can agree on anything else in real time. That's really the benefit of this thing. So all we would need in that instance is an extension protocol that would be relatively slim to agree to move to another delivery service. So there's no lock-in effect in that sense.
Or I guess maybe one of the two users in this case is on that delivery service, and if they change services, that goes with them or something like that. I guess I can see it now.
I mean, we would have to look into edge cases, of course. So
yeah,
if
but I think
both of them
the
just disappear, then that's always a difficult scenario. But if just one of them goes somewhere else, then you can initiate a migration. And I think it should be relatively straightforward because it's very little state that you have on the delivery service. So migrating that.
Yeah, we have more time on this in the next talk. So thank you. Ecker is up. So now we have a 40-minute chunk to go through basically the synthesis of the requirements from all of these drafts and what this protocol needs in general.
So what this definitely is not is me telling you how things ought to be, nor is it a survey of all the proposals. What this is an attempt to go through some of the architectural issues that we had during the discussion of these transports and try to tee them up so we can discuss them plausibly in this conversation. Oh, nice. I'm glad the dates are wrong. That's because I was my last I use this deck.
A lot of time travel.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly. It's in the LaTeX files. What it is actually, because it's Beamer. Next slide. So maybe just try to set a little bit of context so we're all on the same page about what we're trying to do here. Here's my not very good, but nevertheless hopefully plausible architectural diagram of conceptually what a messaging system consists of, right? So we are in the section where I've labeled you are here, namely message transport, which is carrying all the stuff around for everything else in the system, whether that is key establishment via MLS, the encrypted messages themselves once they've been enciphered with MLS, etc. So we're assuming we're only talking about this part of the problem. Other parts of the problem, of course, exist separately. It's not clear exactly where all the cuts are between these places, but this is where we're trying to cut as a reference architecture. Next slide. So to try to take the diagram in a different direction, here's my attempted layer cake of the situation with Mimi transport, whatever it will ultimately be called. I guess Jonathan actually named this thing Mimi transport, but I'm not assuming it's Jonathan's thing. MLS sitting above that and content sitting above that. Very important to recognize that the MLS parts and the content parts are end-to-end between Alice and Bob. We're going to have this discussion all through this working group, which is there are things which Alice and Bob have to agree on, and anything at the encryption layer or above has to be some of those things. The transport, however, does not. The transport has to be, the A and B servers have to agree on it. I'm not taking here a position on owning versus guest server, but in any case, the servers have to agree. It is not clear, in fact, that Alice and Bob have to agree on whatever protocol they use to talk to their own servers, right? So just like email, email is a good example. We can agree on SMTP, but like I may be using webmail and you may be using IMAP, and like that is indifference to me. This is like the mechanics of the situation, right? Next slide. So I think that gets us to like actually, the first thing that so like the way this is going to work here is I've got like a pile of like questions. Sometimes I have a slide that you have the questions. I just have a question. And I just want to make sure like I'm going to stop after each one and make sure like that people kind of agree on like what we're trying to achieve at each stage, because these are hopefully in, I think, descending order of importance, but also maybe ascending order of complexity and painfulness. As I said, obviously the MLS parts and the message content need to be end-to-end, but the message transport does not. Even though many existing systems like XMPP or Simple do in fact define the entire mechanic end-to-end, and I think largely expect that like the protocol that you use to talk to your server is kind of like the protocol you use to talk to the servers you talk to each other, right? I've generally been assuming. This is the one case where I will give an opinion. The client and server were not in scope. Client to server was not in scope, and we're only attempting to find the server to server stuff. If it happened that we selected a protocol that had a client server portion, that would be just fine. But it's not our job to develop that thing. So does anybody think that I'm like off base on this? And actually, we should be defining an end-to-end system like XMPP. Obviously not necessarily XMPP, but like with that concept where like we define the whole thing. Awesome. I'm already people disagree. This is great.
Yeah.
I don't know if that worked. Did it? Anyway, Dr. Robert, Phoenix RD. So yeah, no, I don't disagree per se. I just think it's more nuanced. So I agree that on the transport level, it is server to server. And then on much higher levels, it is client to client. But the open question that relates to my previous talk is, what do we do with the delivery service? How does it fit in there? If it's because either you pick one that is eventually consistent, and then it might just be client to client, and then that's easy, but that's a very conscious choice, or you pick one that is strongly consistent, and then you need to have agreement on the protocol from a client to an owning delivery service. And so that's in between. It's client to server, but not your own servers. It's somebody else's servers, potentially. So that's where the nuance comes in my mind.
I'm not sure I'm following, but I think I'm just going to sit here. So I see you're 40 people in line now. So other people should like help us weigh in on this. Do you want me to say people's names and stuff, or you got it?
I can do it. It's fine.
Awesome.
Vittorio.
So Vittorio Bertola again. I was thinking whether there's actually a regulatory requirement to have a standard client server protocol. I mean, in Europe, of course. I think not. But at the same time, I think there would be value in having a standard client server protocol, and assuming at the same time that some implementation might not use it and might use something different. But at least if there were some standard client server protocol, it might encourage the world to converge to some standardization. But maybe this could be the last item in terms of working once we decide everything else.
DKG.
I just wanted to observe that this question, like clearly this working group is more than just what you're asking about here. You're scoping this talk.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Jonathan.
I just turn it off. There you go. Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". Wanted to sort of disagree with Raphael. I think the server-to-server part combined with the owning provider concept defines a delivery service. There isn't a different delivery service somewhere that we need to spec out. So I think this is strictly server-to-server, and there's nothing separate. And Rowan is about to disagree with me, as always.
Travis.
Sort of echo the slide here. Client server definitely feels out of scope, but obviously we need to specify the format that goes over that wire. And then, yeah, the delivery service, whatever it happens to be, can basically just be passing around bytes and not have to worry about the actual sort of internal format.
Martin.
Hello, Martin Durst. Somebody has mentioned this consistency and so on. And I think that for some things we have to really try to be perfect. Like, I mean, in privacy, if you have a leak, then you're no longer private. But for example, the web, one of the big things that Tim Berners-Lee did is that, well, links could break. So maybe in a chat, consistency is not that important. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
I fear that actually is not as correct as one might like in this case because of the cryptography. That is, if messages get lost, it's not clear you will necessarily be able to recover the cryptographic state.
So I'm going to close the queue. So if you want to be in the queue, please get in. Go ahead, Suhas.
Suhas, Cisco, I agree this should be server to server for two reasons. One is that to be practical, to get something out of this working group soon in the timeline, server to server kind of very well-defined scope. And second thing is also that when we think about the delivery service and how it implies that goes to the layer what Eckert was talking about, the end-to-end, and owning provider and providers represent the DS in my mental model, and we can make it work with the server-to-server scope. Thanks.
Rowan?
Rowan May. I agree that we don't want to define a protocol about how a client talks to a server. However, most people still do not understand that a delivery service is an abstract service, and pieces like parts of the delivery service are going to be, even in a strongly consistent environment, on the owning provider, on the guest providers, and on the clients. And there will be client implications. So I don't think that we really disagree, but I think that the language that we use in this forum matters because people who are listening are going to make some really bad implementation and scope assumptions if we don't keep saying it right, keep saying that correctly. Thanks.
I know, Britta Hale. So echoing Rowan's sentiments there, I think this aspect of the DS, we need to keep it very carefully terminology separate from the server to server or client to server type situation. There are use cases where a server to server backend management will not work, especially in distributed type settings. And although it's okay to have that type of DS realization, we need to make sure that we're not locking ourselves into that.
What do you mean by distributed settings?
Yeah, so without getting into some specifics here, there are settings where you don't actually have one centralized server, where you will have devices talking to devices and self-managing that DS. And so it's a matter of how can you get those devices to communicate among themselves.
My sense is that's actually out of scope for this working group. I mean, the chair, but my sense is that's out of scope, that this is really about federated centralized systems rather than decentralized systems.
Respectfully disagree, because when we talk about federation in some of these settings, we will be federating where it's device to device. And you temporarily, or particularly when I say temporarily, that might be months long, you will not have access to a backend server. And so you will need to be able to have the AS, which of course is this distinction of how we're managing identities and the security of that, actually interfacing, actually interfacing to transfer that identity among the clients themselves. So if we're just talking among clients that have no access to a backend server, they have to be able to distribute these messages ad hoc.
Well, as I say, my sense is that's out of scope, but perhaps you could write up the scenario in detail so we could have a decision from the chair on what we need to do.
Okay, just making sure that we don't lock ourselves in on that terminology. Thanks. Joel.
Hi, I'm Joel Owen from Wicker from AWS. I wanted to make a comment that if we define a client to server interface, it allows us to also do federation in a bit of a different way. Instead of having clients to servers and then servers communicating, clients can just directly connect to the host, to the owning server. And that has certain advantages. First of all, it's one point of failure less. It also hides, metadata from the the original owner server of that client. So I think there's some advantages to defining that interface. It's a simpler system. There's less to define. There's less protocols. This is, there's precedent for this, right? This is how web servers work, right? We always just connect straight to the web server that hosts the website. We don't go through any routing, like that. So I think that's something to consider as well. I don't know if we've settled on this approach with going through servers, right? I'm not sure we've settled on that yet.
All I would say is designs I've seen largely seem to envision that, but maybe we could have a design that a proposed design that didn't envision that. Yes, all I've seen is the proposals I've seen seem to contemplate having that server federation like email or SIP. So I think if there's a proposal for not doing that, like we could look at it. But you should do it quickly.
Yeah.
Matthew Hodgson from Matrix. Something occurred to me that even in a decentralized environment, to Britta's point, you could consider it still as being a client to server, just with the server running locally. And so you need to have the concept of client server, server to server. However, for the MIMI, I really think that the client server technical interface should be completely out of scope, and that we should concentrate on the server to server interrupt side of things. With the exception, as Raphael says, that you also need to consider on the client side the cryptographic implications of what you're doing, particularly if you're using MLS for the group membership side of things. So it's, again, I guess, plus oneing what people have said already. However, there's a final thing that we must not forget, which is the actual user semantics. We touched on it briefly with the threads and the replies interop. That even if you don't worry about what the bits look like between the client and the server, whether that's basically the UX or whether that's literally talking to a remote server somewhere, you have to consider the presentation there, otherwise interop will fail. So we do need it in scope, at least from that presentation semantic.
So I think what we need on this is, given that the existing drafts all sort of focus on server to server and assume this server architecture, for those who disagree with that, to please bring your alternative concepts to the list. Okay. Moving on.
That was the warm-up slide.
That was the easy one. So
next slide. Right. Okay. So this brings us to the topic, the ever popular topic of naming and discovery. Jonathan's draft, I guess I can't remember you called that draft, but had this taxonomy of what's called system-specific identifiers and system-independent identifiers. I'm not sure I love that terminology, but we're going to use it for now. So a system-specific identifier identifies both an identifier and the context of that identifier, namely, like, my phone number on WhatsApp. Obviously, it's the case that like that sort of goofy kind of like pair of information can always be flattened and turned into like some kind of URI, like by putting MIMI in front of it and like putting an @ sign in there, or and then if there's any embedded @ signs, turning them into % signs or whatever such nonsense. I think I've also seen ones that had like the scope at the beginning, but whatever, it's all the same conceptually. By contrast, a system-independent identifier does not tell you the context of the system, and so does not necessarily tell you how to communicate with somebody. It's worth noting that some of these systems have SIIs, which are actually SSIs in some other system. So for instance, if what you have is a phone number, that's assumed to be a routable identifier within the PSTN, it's simply not a routable identifier within the context of multiple instant messaging systems. So if I give you this number 650-555-1000 and you type that into like SMS, it will go somewhere, but you don't know like whether I use WhatsApp or I use Signal or I use iMessage or whatever. There also are ones which do not have, which are not routable identifiers in any system without the system themselves. If I use EKR as my handle, you don't know if that's GitHub or Twitter or a Wire or whatever. In general, an SII is not necessarily enough to contact someone for that reason, because you don't know what system they're on. And it's also the case that the same SII may appear on multiple systems, which I've just like said twice now. Discovery in this context is a process of taking an SII and determining which systems it appears on, so you can actually go talk to somebody. And the sort of conceptual cut I'm trying to make here is that if you have an SSI, you know what to do, but if it's SIA, you got to figure out what to do. Next slide. So the question now is, do we support discovery at all? I think there are a number of possible approaches. These hopefully bolts, you see there are numbers on them. That's what I'm typically using for alternatives. So one possibility is to only solve for SSIs. Say, like, if you don't have an SSI, like, sorry, we're not here to help you right now. There's a sort of intermediate version of that, which is to solve for SSIs now, and then build discovery separately. Just to take a step back, on one, like what this would look like would either be you'd have some unambiguous URL thing that had, like, that had an identifier for the user and then the system, or maybe you have an interface where you type the identifier and there's a drop down that says, like, is this a WhatsApp or is this on iMessage or whatever. And so, like, I think it's possible, but not necessarily, it's at least conceptually possible, but perhaps not actually possible, to do that first thing, and then later to build some system to let you go and figure out which SSIs correspond to which SII. So that's, and then there's a third possibility, which is embedded in conceptually in both Spin and Draft Rosenberg, which is that assume that Alice has some out-of-band channel to contact Bob, which may in fact be an SII, which happens to be a routable identifier and some other thing like the PSTN. And then she can talk to Bob with that mechanism, and that allows you to resolve that to the SII. And that does consent and discovery in the same doodad. Yeah, and so I think this last point is merely that it is residue from, like, a previous version of this, where I observed that in some cases these are themselves routable identifiers, but in the case of, like, if I know Jonathan says that his handle is JD Rosen, I've got to also ask him, like, what's your email address so I can contact you, because I can't even, then JD Rosen doesn't like me to talk to him in any way. I think Matthew's up.
Yeah, so in terms of responding to the question here, the good news is that discovery completely layers separately from everything else we've been talking about. The bad news is that personally, I think it's really important to provide it as a building block, and it's an amazing opportunity to almost solve the PKI problem in terms of mapping people's public keys through to their real life identities, rather than chucking it to the user and making it this horrible UX thing where you say, hey, I want to talk to Eka, but let me select a service provider. Oh, wait, he's using, I know, Mozilla Chat, except my phone doesn't know about Mozilla Chat, so I now got to enter mozilla.org. What is this? It's an email address. It's a disaster. Instead, I should be able to resolve whatever global identifier through to whatever service you want and know that it's you based on your public key.
So one thing I just wanted to add here, just as context, is I too am excited about doing that work. I spent some time thinking about it and come away feeling like it was very difficult to preserve privacy and security all at the same time. And so I think one motivation for round two would be, for version 2 would be, maybe we're not sure we know how to solve it, but I am also excited about doing that work in concept because it's a difficult problem which I like to work on.
Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". Obviously, I like 3, although we've discussed I'm not opposed to necessarily doing some other things too, like supporting SSIs and in-band or what have you. I think this is the more tricky and complex problem. I do want to highlight, like, a consequence of this decision, which you mentioned and Matthew mentioned, but to me it looms big on my mind, which is building systems that actually are usable for users. And one of the consequences of only supporting SSIs is this sort of NASCAR screen where you're going to type in a name and it'll give you a drop-down menu of all of the providers, and that could be really long. In fact, if you imagine, like, larger federation systems, like, it could be 1,000 entries. Still going. And not only can it be long, and what percentage of the use cases is it a known piece of information to the person doing the inviting? And so my worry, and why I continue to work on this problem, is I think if you don't solve this problem, you end up with a easy to design but entirely unusable solution. Thank you.
Yours?
Hi, I'm Joris Baum. My question is not entirely what this slide is about feature discovery. So might that also be in scope? So I'm thinking along the lines of a chat room having integrated like a Grafana graph or or as a, like, I don't know, a poll that's not tied to a single message as far as I just know the concept from Matrix integrations.
Yeah, so I think this is
in scope.
I think it's potentially in scope for this working group, but not for this piece of work. As I understand it, Rowan's specified some stuff how to do feature discovery as part of the key package, and it's not within the key package itself, but like that Rowan specified some work on that. So I think it is in scope for this work, but not for this layer.
It's in the MLS extensions draft, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. John.
Mr. Peterson.
How's it going?
With our roles are reversed.
For once, yes. Yeah, so I guess I'm also here to say that I think the discovery problem is interesting. And part of the reason why I think it's interesting is because even an SSI doesn't necessarily tell you how to get to it, right? In other words, knowing that this telephone number on WhatsApp, is a context of an SSI is not like a URI that you can then like send things to and understand. And so like, I mean, this in many ways relates to the previous comment about features and things like it. I mean, I think there is a broader discovery issue that is not isolated to SIIs that actually needs to be exposed by this, right? And so like, if we don't have that in scope, then what do you do with, an SSI that doesn't already tell you what it would mean for you to reach out to that system, even if perhaps you aren't a user of it natively? And like, that's the actual hard problem that needs to be addressed here.
So,
I mean, again, sequence-wise, I can see these being decoupleable, right? And I could actually see these progressing somewhat independently. I just don't think we're going to have a system that works at all until we actually do this part. It doesn't mean we can't do content format first or whatever else you want first, right? Yeah. But like the system is actually going to work if you don't have a way to even take an an SSI and turn it into this is how I contact that service and why it should care and treat me not as spam.
So I think that one thing that we were getting a little bit of discussion on that I'm not sure it pulled out as well on the slide I was hoping is if you read Director Rosenberg, it has like an answer to this question, which is instead of having an SII start with a routable identifier in some other system. And I guess, and I think, there was some discussion online and offline whether it was an acceptable system. I'll just reveal my biases. I think it's not good enough. But I guess it'd be good if people think that that is a sufficient answer to this question, where I say I don't tell you my identifier. I say send me an email and I'll get back to you and tell you what system I'm on. That'd be good to hear. Or send me an email with this particular format and there's a URL you click on or whatever. If you think that's acceptable, that'd be good to hear because that would help hunt this problem. As I say, my sense is people don't think it's acceptable.
Yeah. A lot of sins are hidden under the 3 letters out of band OOB.
Yeah, as you and I both know. All right.
So do we feel like we kind of landed on 2?
That's sort of my sense.
Yes.
But that's what I would want to do anyway. So.
Okay, good.
Okay. Next slide. All right. So this brings us to the exciting topic of consent. I think we didn't update my slide. That's okay. I'd fix it in the last minute. So like there's sort of 2 kinds of idioms you see in messengers, and I sort of somehow had the notion that like that people had to get consent a lot, but Melissa pointed out to me the other day that's in fact not often how that happens. So like one possibility is I can just like send you messages as long as I have your identifier. So I know, I have your phone number and your WhatsApp, and I just start like blasting away, right? I think I called this YOLO mode in one of these discussions. This is like an obvious spam vector, and one of the things that systems often try to do in order to contain spam is, and it's like going back to like XMPP, it's to require you to get consent first, require you to ask to add someone to your roster, and only then could you message them. I'd say this also goes back to like previous systems where like buddy listing and rosters were also about presence, which like nobody seems to care about anymore. I guess we're now, as Matthew Kaufman would say it, always offline. So anyway, this typically consists of some kind of invite that I send to you that you have to accept before seeing Alice's messages. And the way that this is designed to work, is that the invites have a very restricted domain. So I can't like send you a complete message in my invite, and all you get is like is Alice like to talk to you. Now this isn't like a perfect spam removal technique, and that you can be like make money fast, like to talk to you, but it does restrict the situation quite a lot. These are sort of the 2 like modalities you often see in these systems. I'm just going to step, this is just like overview. So I've got like actually some question slides. So I'm going to talk to that in a second, and then maybe Raphael and whoever's after them can chat. Next slide. Oh, okay. Well, that wasn't good. Let's not talk about that. Can I see the next slide? Maybe I just got confused at what happened. Oh, good. Yeah. Okay. Let's not talk about key packages yet. Right. So I guess the question is, what mode should we be supporting here, right? Can Alice just send message to Bob? Another possibility that we talked about is like this sort of quarantine stuff, where I can send messages to you, but like Bob's like system doesn't show them until like you accepted. There's concerns here about like excess data on Bob's side, but if the main issue about spam is like the user offensiveness of seeing it, then this actually does help to solve the problem. And finally, like Alice can't do anything until Bob consents. The previous slide was about some cryptographic issues about like whether or not like how possible like 1 and 2 are. But like let's hold off on those for now, because I think probably this is a more relevant point. So I think like there's like, I guess the real question is not so much exactly how this is to be designed, but what models of the system to assume. And in particular, if the system assumes like that 1 is at least possible in many cases, do we have adequate controls for managing spam in those situations? And do we have to design it? Whereas maybe if like we only say you have to get consent first, we can be less aggressive about designing spam mechanism and worry about abuse less. I don't have a strong answer, but like this is like a core question that we thrashed around a lot in previous discussions. So I'm like gonna shut up and like hear what people say.
And as Richard has pointed out in the chat, that it's possible to support multiple of these modes. It's not
right.
We're not picking
I think right. I think the key question I think one has to answer is like, what is the like most YOLO mode you have to support? Because that tells you what the mechanisms you have to do to make that viable are.
Raphael.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, so on a technical level, with MLS, you can definitely do both. So and it was specifically designed that way, so that you don't have to wait for a round trip or whatever.
Absolutely.
But spam is going to be a problem in federated environments, so it's something we have to take very seriously. And so my gut feeling is that we probably want to have this consent mechanism first. But what I'm not sure about is whether that's a decision that individual apps should take, in the sense that you can send content already and just not display it, or whether we should forbid sending content altogether. Again, that's going to be a question of policy, not so much of technical feasibility.
I think that's also correct. There's a few MLS subtleties, but we can manage them, as you mentioned in your email, the list. Mr. Jennings.
Can you go back one slide? Oh no, one more slide back. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think that this is going to be a really important property for how to design some pieces of the system. It's going to determine what works. And I don't really think that consent is really inherently ever turned out to be a great solution, or it's just the first part of talking about the solution, right? Whether you do it or not. And it has to do with whether there's messages there or not. And what turned out to have more to do with trying to block these things was almost all, like tons of the messaging, the large messaging systems today, force you to tie it to something that's expensive, a little bit expensive to get, so you don't have an infinite number of identities, right? Generally forced to prove that you have a phone number associated with the account is an example of that. But I think we need to talk about what are those things that we think that we need to support at this level. And we're not, we can't design a system where a gatekeeper is forced to just allow an infinite amount of garbage to come into their system. So we've got to think about what are the identities, how can you not have an infinite number of identities, what are the reputation systems you attach to that, and those types of things. And like consent by itself, we need to describe like, is there contact, is there user provided content that goes with that, all of those types of issues. It would be nice if we could just totally push those down the road, kick that can down the road. I'd love that at some level. But I think to have a viable solution here, we're going to have to dig into the requirements of this a bit more.
So one thing I just wanted to add a little color to that what you were just saying, Colin, is that there's another mechanism that often is popular is feedback from the receiver to the sender of various kinds. And so the quality of feedback you get for within a consent versus non-consent environment differs. So in in non-consent environments, all you get is negative feedback. You get complaints. I didn't like this message someone sent me. But in consent environments, you can also, one form of feedback you also get is, what fraction of these people's consent messages got accepted. And so again, it just goes back to like trying to define what spam control measures are viable in each environment, was very important, I think.
I'm going to close the queue momentarily. So if you want to get in, please get in now. Jonathan.
Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". So I was originally on the consent only, but my mind was changed by something Alyssa said, so I think it's worth repeating, which is in essence that there's a zeroth law of requirements when it comes to this working group. She didn't say it this way, but this is how I'm repeating it. The zeroth law of robotics on this thing is like, if it's unacceptable to the gatekeepers, then like you may as well take your cookies and go home. And so if we think about it that way, what is the probability that we here in this room make a decision on something of this magnitude that is in fact acceptable and good with every one of the gatekeepers and all the people that want to federate them? I put that probability at exactly 0. And therefore, we probably should take a stance where the protocol supports variability and integrates capability for different choices to be made on an individual or bilateral basis that allows it to be compatible with the models that each of these different providers support, because they do indeed support different providers. Like to techniques like Wire does connection-based consent, which I think I don't personally enjoy, but that's okay. That's a decision that Wire made. iMessage does the send it, forget it, YOLO approach, and like how are those going to work together? And like that is probably going to come to how Apple and Wire connect to each other. So I'm in favor at this point of making the protocol support a variety of flavors and allowing it to be usefully negotiated in the system. Thank you.
Thanks, Rowan.
Hi, Rowan May. A quick correction to what Jonathan said. So Wire does the connection approach if you're not in the same team. But I'd like to, for these modes here, if we implement 3 right away, can we decide later, or do we need to know now? And that's not me saying that we should. I'm asking you.
My sense is my sense is yes. I think my sense is that like every mechanism, every spam control mechanism you need that you need for consent, you will also need for the other mechanisms as well. You just need more. And so my sense is like, if you were feeling antsy, just to answer your technical question, if you're feeling antsy about your ability to control spam in like situations 1 and 2, then like then you could start with 3. I don't think there, and as Raphael said, I don't think any technical reason why 3 and 1 and 2 are different from an MLS perspective in a really serious way. There's some subtleties.
Okay, so I'm just going to say that I think that modeling this as there are a bunch of authorization decisions, and that any of these mechanisms that we implement are basically need to be authorized by a particular policy.
That seems like a good framing, actually.
Travis.
The sort of second mode there, I think, is probably the one that we would want to go for, as it provides basically the most compatibility with the existing sort of providers. The ones that do require sort of like Alice to actually be accepted before Bob will see those messages. That's obviously mode 2 there. And then with all the other providers that do just allow you to send messages like SMS and that sort of stuff, they could say auto approve on the server side if they needed to. And then same thing with consent. You could implement a sort of client server API that manages that interaction for you.
Can you scroll back 1 slide, Elisa? Oh, sorry. I wanted the
key package
package one. Yeah. So I think there's one point I wanted to make about like the technical point that I think Raphael and I were chatting about this too, is that anything which allows some mechanism you might imagine that consent went without, you could ask for consent without knowing if someone actually existed. You could be like, I think I have your phone number. I want to see if you're on WhatsApp. I'm just going to ask for consent. And the system would like refuse to tell you until the person had consented. Any mechanism which allows you to like start sending messages right away, whether it is pre-consent or whether it's like, consent in quarantine, necessarily like leaks whether or not the person is on the system. We can talk about whether you could chaff that, but I don't think you can effectively. So there's a privacy there's a privacy tie-in here. There's also this question of like what happens if these key packages they get exhausted because of these forward secrecy issues. So so like there's like it's not like I do think it's viable to have a client quarantine mechanism, but it's not like a totally straightforward like flip switch policy switch.
We're running low on time, so please be brief.
Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. So I agree that this is something that's going to need to be able to be negotiated within the system. I don't think one model will work for everyone. And I wanted to actually make it a little bit more complicated, which is
Time's up.
That that the consent can also be revoked. And if you have this quarantining thing, there's a certain amount that's quarantined, and maybe you only want to get a couple messages from the quarantine before you allow them to send you 1 million offers for penis enlargement. And so we need to think about this over time as well. And I mean, it's related to blocking and all of that. So I think this is something that we are going to think about, and the cryptographic properties and the guarantees that we offer to the users will be different for messages that are in these liminal states, because I think the providers will have more visibility and control over them.
John.
Yeah, I was going to come up here and say anything but one, but having heard Jonathan and thinking about, oh, of course, there are going to be providers who are willing to, SMS each other that are effectively gatekeepers, right? I mean, I think to Cullen's original point, I see a very complex design space around this actually that needs a requirements document of its own and its own like whole scope to try to figure out what this would look like, to have multiple gatekeepers negotiating with each other what consent they're willing to allow, right? Maybe even on a per user basis.
Harold.
Hello, John. I think this question is completely at the wrong level. We need to get information from the sender to the receiver that they want to send a message. It's actually reduces to the same problem with when the receiver is a room as when it's a person. The receiver needs to be able to evaluate that against his own set of rules, which may be private, maybe complex, maybe non-standard, maybe anything. And sometimes the receiver needs to tell the network that I want help in making sure that this sender does not ask again. But the policy is not part of the transport protocol. Adding a function to ask for help in blocking these messages before they waste too much time could be a property of the transport protocol, but the policy isn't.
Pete.
Sorry, Pete Resnick. Following up on what Harold said, I'm concerned that that's not the only problem, because depending on the scale of this for some providers, they may want to help whether or not the receiver wants the help and block things before consent occurs. So I suspect we're gonna have to put in some mechanism at the provider level to require some sort of consent.
Probably should sit down at this point.
I'm sorry?
Probably I should sit down at this point.
Lucky you. Okay. Well, obviously we have a lot of thorny issues to continue to work through. Maybe Tim, if you could bring us up to the.
It's too bad because the rest of the slides actually had answers for all
Yeah,
the
there's
issues.
like 12 more issues in this deck that we didn't get to.
But they just had like, they were easy.
Yeah. So I think, we should start some separate threads on the mailing list to continue the discussion on these topics and probably just get together with the authors as well to think about the path forward. But obviously we have like a lot more to discuss on almost all of those things. And so what Tim and I are proposing is that we kickstart a series of virtual meeting interims on a regular cadence, because this is we have many weighty topics and we have these externally imposed deadlines, depending on how you want to interpret them. So we feel like we are really going to need to kind of drive hard to make progress on all of these things. And to do that, we'd like to meet often virtually, starting in a couple of weeks, and doodle on the list for a time slot. Any reactions to that? positive or negative.
Yeah, sorry, I wish I had logged in. I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of the structure. And I should have told you that offline. I should have told you that before when I saw these slides. Like I think the structure work that we used for Quick and for TLS on the HTTP is like much better, of like somewhat frequent, like full like several day interims. I find like this kind of stuff, like it's like very hard. Like I just managed like get my state back when like I've got when I you know. And like, so like having like that kind of clock is very difficult for me, but like other people like it then.
Okay. I mean, those are also not mutually exclusive.
Sure.
So, yeah, I can imagine here at the beginning, we could need a couple days. So that's another option. Okay. And then just the other note here, because we are trying to, drive towards externally imposed deadlines. We'd like to think maybe a little bit creatively about how the working group agrees on stable targets for interop as we proceed over the next year or so. Maybe some process where the chairs establish deadlines for PR submissions, and if we haven't heard too many objections, then they just get folded in to the drafts that end up getting adopted by the working group. So we're still thinking about that. If people have suggestions on what kind of a process they think would work, we're definitely open to that, but we just wanted people to be aware. We might try something a little different. That's a good question. Yeah, the question was about whether we should turn Ecker's issues list into a set of GitHub issues where we can have the discussion. Any preferences on whether we use GitHub issues or whether we use the mailing list?
Yeah, we have GitHub issues. That's a different question than where we discuss.
I can't hear what you're saying, so.
Well, we should definitely have GitHub issues. I defer to the chairs and where we discuss things, but we should definitely have GitHub issues to track what we're discussing.
I feel like when we're in the sort of pre-document phase that it's maybe a little easier to have the discussions on the list. Yes, yeah. Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to wrap up. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, everybody, especially to the speakers.